Hi, we are back. You are now watching the second video for Module 2, Topic 4 on Community Ecology. In the last video, I spent some time introducing you to community ecology and the different types of species interactions. And so we talked about competition, predation, and symbiosis. You got really quick introduction to those topics. But then I spent the rest of the time talking to you about competition, the difference between interspecific competition and intraspecific competition, and also describing competitive exclusion. So in this video, we're going to discuss the other two types of species interactions, namely predation and symbiosis. So you probably have a pretty good idea already of what predation is, but here's a good definition. Predation is the process that one organism, the predator, captures and feeds upon another organism, that's the prey. And if you remember from the last recording, we talked about the interaction between these two species, having one species, the predator, benefiting from the interaction, and the other species, the prey, being harmed by the interaction. So here you have a lynx that's attacking a snowshoe hare. We're going to talk a little bit more about that kind of relationship in a minute. And over here you have a cormorant who's feeding on a fish, maybe a pike or something like that. So both of these are great examples of predation, where you have the predator attacking and presumably consuming the prey item. So this is the same chart that I showed you in the last video. And like I said before, in the last video, we spent most of the time talking about competition, and now we're going to focus on predation. So predation, remember, is when you have a positive effect on one species, and that would be the predator, and a negative effect on the second species, which would be the prey. Now, while the idea of predation seems pretty simple, there can be some complex interactions that occur. For example, we can look at something called a predator-prey cycle. A predator-prey cycle is when the predator and prey seem to have a close relationship in terms of their population sizes. Let's talk about what a population size is if you're not familiar with that topic. The population size is just the number of individuals of a particular species that are interacting in a particular area. So if we want to talk about the predator-prey interaction between the Canadian lynx, which is right here, and the snowshoe hare, which is right here, if we're talking about the population size of them, we're talking about just how many individuals there are of the lynx versus how many individuals there are of the snowshoe hare. So let's start over here. There has been a long-term study on the Canadian lynx and the snowshoe hare. The study has been taking place in northern Canada since at least 1850 and probably even before that. We have information from trapping and skins and all of those sorts of things. And the study actually continues today. And the reason why this population has been studied is because it shows this really interesting predator-prey cycle. So if we start on this side over here, let's begin with a normal prey population, which just means basically an average number of snowshoe hares. So we're going to start with the prey, the snowshoe hare. If something causes that prey population to decrease, let's say there was a drought or something like that, so their food, which could be grasses or seeds or something, maybe those become less available because there's a drought, not a lot of rain. So if the population of these hares, this prey population, decreases, what you see is that there's fewer prey, fewer hares for the predator to consume. And so in response, the predator population has less food And so fewer of them survive, and you end up with a smaller predator population. As that predator population decreases, some of the predation pressure on the hares is released. So the hares can maybe reproduce at a faster rate with fewer predators. And then we also have to assume that the grasses and the seeds are coming back. Maybe the drought is over. So with reduced predator pressure and some recovery of the food of the prey population is going to increase again. So now the prey population increases, partially because there were fewer predators, and maybe also because now there's more food available. And as that prey population increases, the predator population can increase because now they have more food. So more lynxes reproduce, they have more offspring, the population size grows, more individuals are available in the area. And as that population size of the predator increases, that may cause a reduction again in the prey population. So what we have is these predator and prey interacting with one another in a way that affects their population sizes. So let's look over here on this graph, which represents real data from the study. So if we start here around 1860, just because this is a pattern that's a little bit easier to see, we're going to follow the hare population, which is the blue line. In about 1860, you see a really low population of hares, not very many of them. But then there's probably plenty of resources because there's very few hares. And as the resources are being consumed by the hares, the population of hares is increasing. You have basically a great big population boom, lots and lots of hares reproducing in a really short period of time, presumably because there's a lot of resources for them. As that hare population increases, that's the prey again, and there's a response from the lynx population, which are the predators. As more prey become available, then the lynx population can increase because there are more and more food resources for it. And so reproduction is really good for the lynxes, and their population numbers grow as well. So up here you have this great big boom population size of the hare, of the prey. And maybe they run out of resources again. I'm not sure what caused this population to start declining, but probably all of the grass got eaten, all of the seeds were eaten because there were so many of them, and now the population goes into decline. Back into decline, and as the snowshoe hare population declines, you can see that the lynx population follows right behind it with fewer and fewer numbers of lynxes until now you have a low population of hares and a low population of lynxes. And as the population of lynxes is really low, now it looks like the hares are able to recover. They don't have a lot of predators, and resources probably became available again. So you can see this sort of long-standing pattern of the hare having really high numbers in their populations, and then really low numbers, and then really high numbers again, and really low numbers. So it's sort of a boom and bust cycle for the hares. And you can see that the lynx population, the predator, is sort of following right behind it, lagging behind just a little bit. It seems as if the predator population is influenced very much by the prey population. It's similar pattern, but lagging just a little bit behind. Another thing to notice is that this cycle, this predator-prey cycle, appears to occur more or less every 10 years with some variation. But the 10 to 11 year cycle has been recorded for essentially the entire time the data have been collected. Something that I want to make sure that is clear is that this predator-prey cycle isn't entirely simple. So while the predator, the lynx, appears to be strongly influenced by the population size of the hares are not only being controlled by how many predators there are. Sure, as the number of lynxes increases, they're putting more pressure predator pressure on the hares. They're eating more hares, and that's probably causing some decrease in population. But studies have demonstrated that the hares are actually more influenced by their own food resources. That's really what's driving this boom and bust cycle for the hares. And the predator, the lynx, is very reliant on the hare as its main food item. And so that's why the lynx curves seem to be following so closely with the hare curves. If that lynx had multiple different types of prey that it could feed upon, lots of other prey options, we wouldn't see this kind of close tie between the numbers of hares and then the number of lynxes following so closely behind. That relationship would not be nearly as tight. So the reason it is again, because the lynx's main prey item is this hare. There are so many hares around, and not a lot of other prey items for them. Another thing I want to note is that during this entire set of data being collected, you can see that at no point does the population of hare or the population of lynx reach zero. That's probably because the hares have a place somewhere to hide. So even if there's only a few individuals, a couple individuals survive and are able to reproduce, which allows the population to recover. Same thing goes for the lynx, where it never reaches zero. Probably there's some other less common prey items for them to eat. And so while the populations get really, really low, they don't ever reach zero. And that's why this population, both of these populations are able to cycle at high and low levels, just because they never reach zero. But what happens when you have a much more simple situation between predator and prey? Here's a graph that represents if the prey have nowhere to hide from the predators and they're just in an open environment, what do you think happens? So what happens is both species, predator and prey, will go extinct. Which one goes extinct first? Can you tell by the graph? So what happens is you have this, assuming that the prey have a lot of resources, population of prey gets really high, then you add predators, and once you add the predators, they eat all of the prey, and then the prey get all eaten, and so that population reaches zero, and if that population reaches zero, there's nothing to recover, and then the predator will also die. So this is assuming we just have one type of predator, one type of prey, nowhere for anyone to hide, and you wouldn't get a cycle like that. You would basically just get both species going extinct. So the prey would go extinct first, and then the predator would follow. Okay, so now we have completed the part of the lecture on predator and prey. And so we're going to move on to the third category of species interactions, and that is symbiosis. Now, there are multiple types of symbiosis, so we want to make sure that we are identifying each of those different categories of symbiosis. Symbiosis is one of these terms that often gets misused. A lot of people use the word symbiosis as two species that are interacting together, individuals of two species that are interacting together with both of them benefiting. But actually, that's just one category of symbiosis. The actual definition of symbiosis is when there's a relationship between two different organisms of different species that are living together in close association. So here we have this picture of a clownfish in an anemone, and it's playing on the keep your enemies closer, keep your friends close, but keep your anemones closer. This is considered a mutualistic relationship where both the clownfish and the sea anemone are both benefiting, but a lot of people would just refer to that as symbiosis. It is a type of symbiosis, but only one specific category. So let's talk about the different types of symbiotic relationships. As I mentioned, the sea anemone and the clownfish are an example of a mutualism, and we'll get to that in just a second. So a mutualism is a type of symbiotic relationship. Again, that means a close association between two or more species. We're going to keep it simple by just using two species at a time. And in a mutualism, both species are benefiting. So there's so many examples of this, and I don't want to go into too many details, but we'll talk about these three. So in this first example, we see a bee, and the bee is pollinating a flower. And both species are going to benefit from this relationship. So the bee is getting nectar from the flower, and it's using that as food. And as it is getting nectar from the flower, it's getting pollen on its legs or on different parts of its body as it is sort of probing this flower. The pollen that it gets from this flower, it will carry to another flower where it gets more nectar. And that is the way that this flower, this plant, can do sexual reproduction. So by moving the pollen from one flower to another, it is allowing this flowering plant to reproduce. So the bee gets food out of the relationship, and the plant gets reproduction out of the relationship. The next example of a mutualism is this reef fish and a cleaner shrimp. So cleaner shrimp set up little spaces on a reef, sometimes on a coral head, and they can advertise to the fish around them. And you can see that this fish is clearly large enough to eat the shrimp. But the fish learn where the cleaner shrimp are, and they hover over the area where the cleaner shrimp is hanging out. And then they open up their mouths and open up their gills, and they allow the cleaner shrimp to enter their mouth and remove parasites and dead skin. And so the cleaner shrimp gets food because it's feeding on the parasites and the dead skin from the fish, and the fish gets its parasites removed. So it's a really good mutualistic relationship. And then finally, we're going to go to the clownfish and the anemone, the very popular example of a mutualism. And both species, again, are going to benefit from this. The sea anemone, these are all actually stinging tentacles, which for most fish, it would sting and paralyze the tentacles, and then that fish, the prey item, would be moved to the mouth of the anemone. But the clownfish has an adaptation where it can rub its body against the sea anemone, and it increases its mucus covering on its body, which then makes it completely immune to the stinging cells of the sea anemone. So what the clownfish gets out of this relationship is it gets a very safe place to hang out where no predators are going to be able to get to it. And what the sea anemone gets out of it is that the clownfish being present within the sea anemone actually attracts other fish to think it's a safe place. And so those fish will get close, and then the sea anemone is able to consume those visiting fish as food. And again, the clownfish is unharmed, and it benefits from living and being protected by the anemone. Okay, the second type of symbiotic relationship, and again, I just want to remind you that a symbiotic relationship is a close association between two species. So the second type of symbiotic relationship is commensalism. This is when one species in this close relationship is benefiting from the relationship and the other is unaffected. Again, lots of different examples of commensalisms. A really common one to be used is the commensal relationship between cattle egrets and different versions of cows or buffalo or grazing animals. So the buffalo, in this case, this is an African buffalo. African buffalo gets no benefit and is not harmed by this relationship with the cattle egret. But as the African buffalo or cow or whatever you happen to be talking about is grazing, it's disturbing some insects and other critters in the grass. And so those become exposed, and the cattle egrets now have the food that becomes much more available to them because the insects are sort of disturbed by the grazing of the African buffalo. So the species that is benefiting in this case is the cattle egret, and the buffalo is not impacted in a positive or negative way. Another example is barnacles on whales. So this is a humpback whale, and you can see little barnacles that are growing on the outside of the mouth of the humpback whale. And barnacles are a type of crustacean. They're actually kind of closely related to crabs or shrimp. And they don't harm the whale in any way, but as part of the commensal relationship, the barnacles get a stable place to be established. They get a free ride to wherever the whale is going to go, and they get plenty of food, because as the whale is moving through the water, that exposes the barnacles to lots of little creatures in the ocean that it can filter feed. So it's constantly being exposed to new water where there's lots of little creatures for the barnacles to feed on. And then the third example of commensalism is remoras and sharks. And a lot of people have heard of this relationship. These remoras actually, that's the fish under here, underneath the shark. Remoras have an area on the top of their head, which is sort of like a suction cup, and they can attach to a shark. It's kind of a similar relationship to what the barnacles have on the whales. The remora doesn't harm the shark in any way. It basically just hitches a ride. So again, it can travel through the ocean without using any energy because it's attached to the shark. And whenever the shark feeds on anything, the remoras have the benefit of getting the scraps or any leftovers that happen to be floating around in the water. So the remoras benefit and the sharks are not affected. And the last symbiotic relationship we're going to talk about is parasitism. So in parasitism, again, we have a close relationship between two species, and one species benefits and the other one is harmed. So in this case, the parasite is the thing that is benefiting, and the host is the organism that is harmed. It's a close relationship between two species. Usually the parasite is smaller than the host, and usually the parasite does not kill the host, but it still benefits. It's typically getting a meal. So one example of a parasite that you're all aware of is, here's a tick that is feeding on the blood of a dog. This is one that may be a little bit less common. You may not have heard of this. This is a caterpillar. This is the host. And these tiny little white things are cocoons or pupae of wasps. So a female wasp will come and lay eggs inside the caterpillar. Those eggs will hatch. The baby wasp larvae will feed on many different parts of the inside of the caterpillar, and then when they are ready to turn into adults, they pupate on the outside of the caterpillar. The caterpillar is still alive and it's still eating, but it won't be alive for much longer after these wasps emerge. And here's a really disgusting example of parasitism. Here we have a parasitic crustacean right here that is a parasite on fish, and it literally eats the tongue of the fish, and then it takes the place of the tongue of the fish. And when the fish eats, it also gets food. So that's a really gross example. But again, one that's not that well. You may not have heard of that one before. But in each of these cases, we see very close relationships between the parasite and the host, which makes it a symbiotic relationship. So let me just throw this table up here one more time. This is a summary of how the different species are affected in all of these different interactions. And remember, the main interactions were competition, where both species or both individuals who are in competition are negatively impacted by that interaction. Then we had predation, which is where you have a predator and prey, and the predator has a positive result from the interaction, while the prey has a negative result. It gets consumed. And then we have the three different types of symbiosis: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So, so we've discussed all of those. In mutualism, we have positive impacts on both species that are interacting. In commensalism, we have a positive impact for one species and neither a positive nor negative effect on the second species. And then for parasitism, It's similar to predation in that we have a positive impact on one species, that would be the parasite, and a negative impact on the other species, which would be the host. But we have this predation and parasitism that have basically the same results in terms of the effects on the two different species. So how do we separate those two? What's the difference between them? So again, the similarities are that predation and parasitism both have positive effects on one organism and a negative effect on the other. So here we've got a fish, that's the host, and we have a parasite. This is a lamprey. It's another type of a fish, but that it acts as a parasite. This lamprey is benefiting, this host fish is being harmed. Here we have a predator, a lion, which is benefiting from this interaction, and the zebra is the prey item, and it is being harmed. So what are the differences between parasitism and predation? There are two main differences. One is that parasites are part of a symbiotic relationship. That means there has to be a close relationship between the two species, and you see that in parasitism and you do not see it in predation. So here you have these lampreys which are attached to the fish for long periods of time, and a predator-prey interaction does not occur over long periods of time. It is sort of an instantaneous interaction. And predators always kill their prey. So this is another difference. Parasites usually do not kill their hosts. In some cases they do, like for example in that parasitoid example with the wasp larvae and pupae and the caterpillar. So they can kill their hosts, but very rarely do parasites kill their hosts. And usually the parasites are much smaller than the hosts, whereas in predation it's the opposite. So those are the differences between predation and parasitism. And that is the end of our lectures on community ecology. So that's the end of the second unit. And the third unit will be on Alabama biodiversity and conservation biology.